Good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Meredith Warner, about to give another talk in our series of free education, mostly just because I like to teach and I love to learn, and this kind of combines those two activities and lets me empower you with more knowledge, which is one of my missions in life. So this is part 2 of a series I'm doing on the food industry, sort of the state of our food. I know right now it's sort of trendy. People are starting to hear about the food industry and what it's kind of done to us. But at the Well Theory, we've been talking about this for years now. You are what you eat, as your mother told you. It is a true fact. And eating whole, real foods that actually exist on the planet Earth seems to be an important feature for good health, we're learning. Surprisingly, right? Part 1 of this talk, I talked about the advent of the food industry in this country, which really started with Kellogg's and cornflakes. Now we're going to move on to Fritos and Cheetos, and I'm going to talk about those, their history, and then sort of how we switched from natural oils to processed oils and what processed oils may or may not be doing you. It's not too heavy on the science this time, though. So let's talk about it. All right, the Cheetos, perhaps one of the most finely engineered foods in the world. Very delicious, very addictive. I pretty much don't know anybody that doesn't love a Cheeto. You just really kind of have to tell yourself you don't want them. Charles Doolin put this whole concept together in 1948. That's how old the Cheeto is. So just to give you a little historical context, because I think it's sort of fascinating. And part of the whole picture of what's going on in the food industry. In 1948, when Charles Doolin, I don't want to say invented, but developed the Cheeto, at that time, Ben-Gurion declared independence of the state of Israel. So what happened? The Arab states invaded Israel, and that was the start of the Arab-Israeli War. So 1948. Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated in that year as well. Truman signed an order in 1948, President Truman, to end racial segregation in the United States Armed Forces, believe it or not. And then at the same time, the US passed a bill that funded the Marshall Plan, where we went in to help rebuild and defend Western Europe after World War II, and we're still doing that. So all of this happens in 1948. At the same time, Charles Doolin brings us the Cheeto. So to understand Cheetos, you must understand Fritos. Fritos were invented in San Antonio, Texas. Okay, this is basically started from a fried corn dough that was just a popular street food. It was like something vendors would make and sell on the beaches in Texas at the time and in Mexico. Doolin at the time owned a candy store. He came from a family of confectioners in San Antonio. They wanted more products because at this time, it was the beginnings of the Depression, 1932 to be exact. People were out of work. I think something like 25% of the country was unemployed. The stock market lost 90% of its value. It was basically doom and gloom everywhere. People were not doing well. Nobody had a spare nickel to buy anything, and Doolin's sales were going down. So he needed something cheap that was easy and that would make people want to buy them. So in 1932, he spent $100 thanks to his mom, who actually pawned her wedding ring to give him that seed capital for this company, which is now worth billions, of course. Starts with $100 from a pawned wedding ring from his mother, and he buys this recipe that was for sale. He saw it in a classified ad. Gustavo Olguin sold the recipe for this fried corn dough product. Okay, so that's sort of the backdrop of this part of the processed food industry. Great Depression, needed something cheap and easy to make that he could sell, that was palatable, that would keep people coming back and buying more and more and more. Thus was born the Frito. So the initial production of the Frito was actually what we would now consider minimally processed. Perhaps you remember this from other talks. There's unprocessed, minimally processed, processed, and ultra-processed foods. 80% of the American diet turns out to be processed and ultra-processed. What you really want is unprocessed and minimally processed. Think of minimally processed like what you do to food in the kitchen when you cook it, like adding spices, a little bit of heat, whatever. When you start getting into processed and ultra-processed, then you're talking about chemicals, factory production, et cetera. So at this time, what would happen is Charles Doolin would go out, he would find very high quality corn, buy it from the farmers, bring it home, he hand washed it, separated it, ground it by hand, probably with one of those hand milling things. And then his family would help him hand roll the dough out into thin strips, and then they would deep fry it, and this was all in their kitchen. So that's it. That's all the initial Frito was. Then production had to get bigger and bigger because it turned out to be very, very popular, despite the fact that he was selling it during the Depression. Bear in mind, it was a nickel for a bag of these at the time. He moved his production to the garage. Then they had to rent out the neighbor's duplex and so on and so forth. So he kept expanding production as demand went up. Turns out demand kept going up. But it started out minimally processed. By 1955, there was a partnership that had developed between Charles Doolin and none other than Walt Disney. Walt Disney had a vision for his whole empire, if you will, and part of that was Disneyland, the first amusement park. So he had a partnership with Charles Doolin to introduce Tex-Mex food to the rest of the world as part of the whole Disneyland concept. Think of Epcot Center and that you go to now in Disney World and Disneyland. So it was a way to bring foods of the world and like introduce those things to people, and it would draw in tourists and bring tourist money. So Tex-Mex was introduced to the world, Disneyland, 1955, with this partnership between Disney and Doolin. And the restaurant in Disneyland was called Casa de Fritos, and it was born August 11th, 1955. It was a quick service restaurant in Frontierland in that amusement park. And the biggest attraction was this Frito Kid machine. There's a picture of it here on the slide that people would put some money in, and the Frito Kid would throw out a bag of Fritos or corn chips. And so that's what really exploded the popularity, is when it's made its appearance at Disneyland. Eventually, Fritos leads to Doritos. How does it do that? Well, there was a restaurant team at Casa de Fritos. And this whole product actually came about 10 years later. Hold on. Sorry, we're having a technical issue. Thank you. So this came about 10 years later, okay? So remember, Fritos 55 really started in 32 with the recipe, 55 to Disneyland. 66, the Doritos launch. The restaurant team at Casa de Fritos had leftover tortillas, and what they would do is they would just flavor them with taco seasoning that they had around in the kitchen, and then deep fry them, and thus were born the Doritos. Dorito is a contraction of the Spanish word doradito, which means little fried and golden thing. So from dorado, which is gold, of course. So they contracted it, and they would just call them Doritos. And they were inspired by this classic Mexican dish called totopo, which is made from the nixtamalization of corn, which, if you remember from the first talk about cornflakes, that's an important process whereby using lye or some base solvent, the hull of the corn is taken away, and then you can process the inner part of the kernel, which is, of course, devoid of any fiber because you've gotten rid of the fiber. Anyway, this eventually began to get so popular and big that they had to move production of the Dorito to a Tulsa plant due to overwhelming demand. So the Fritos was born of desperation during the Great Depression. Doritos was born of ingenuity by the restaurant team who just wanted something different to eat. And then both of these became massively best-selling brands. In 1993, as an example, the sales of Doritos alone was $1.2 billion. Now, do you think Charles Doolin could have ever imagined that? No. It was about a third of the sales for Frito-Lay during that year. In 1994, they actually redesigned the Dorito. They had 5,000 chip eaters in a study, so they paid people to eat chips and just keep testing how they tasted. It was a 2-year-long study, and they eventually made a Dorito that was 20% larger, 15% thinner, and had rounded corners. Why would the Dorito need rounded corners, you say? Well, of course, because of a lawsuit. Somebody sued Doritos and Frito-Lay saying that the sharp edges of the Dorito hurt their mouths. And of course, you know, as with everything, they had to change their whole production because of one silly lawsuit. So now they have rounded corners. Anyway, just so you know, though, Oxidative stress markers are always higher when you eat these ultra-processed foods, especially if you have things like metabolic syndrome. So older adults with metabolic syndrome that eat Doritos, you're always going to be more chronically inflamed because of the ultra-processing. And I put this top thing up from Cura, which is a website that does like deep dives into questions in science and mathematics and physics and politics and stuff. And the question is Dorito technically a vegetable? And sadly, the answer is yes, as is the tomato sauce on the pizzas that they serve at school lunches, which our government considers to be a vegetable, and they count it towards the servings of vegetables for school kids. So what are the ingredients of the Dorito, you might ask yourself? Are these minimally processed? I would probably say no. They do have corn, but they also have vegetable oil, corn, soy, and sunflower. So that's fun, a little mixture, proprietary blend. Salt, of course, cheddar cheese, maltodextrin, another word for sugar, whey, MSG, monosodium glutamate, buttermilk solids, Romano cheese, whey concentrate, onion powder, partially hydrogenated soybean oil just to even out the vegetable oils, partially hydrogenated cottonseed oil, again, to help out those vegetable oils, a little bit of corn flour, some disodium phosphate, some lactose, another word for sugar, natural flavors, artificial flavors, dextrose, another word for sugar, tomato powder, it is a vegetable, spice, lactic acid, yellow number 6, the all-important, yellow number 6, yellow number 5, and red 40 in your Doritos, citric acid, sugar, another word for sugar, garlic powder, red and green bell pepper powder, some sodium caseinate, and some disodium guanylate. Why not? Non-fat milk solids, whey protein isolate, and of course, corn syrup solids. Can't have a Dorito without corn syrup solids, right? Wow. So I put this picture here to show you what I always tell my patients. If you can't picture a tree or a bush in nature growing this particular food that you're about to eat, you probably shouldn't be eating it. And if you do eat it, it should be in scant quantities. So I don't know of any Dorito trees that use all of these little ingredients to produce a Dorito in any natural way. Therefore, this is an ultra-processed food. Therefore, it should be avoided. And you might be asking yourself, because I did, what is a corn syrup solid? What does it even mean? Turns out it's dehydrated corn syrup. So it's basically heated up corn syrup that's, it spits out the water and spray dried, and it extends the shelf life of food products. And it sweetens without adding liquids. So they basically dehydrate sugar, corn syrup specifically, and put it on your Dorito so it can sweeten it. It's primarily glucose, which is the good news. At least it's not high fructose corn syrup. And it improves the texture. But basically, it's another way to add sugar to a salty food, which turns out that combination is highly addictive. Okay, so what happened to Casa de Fritos? Born in 1955, 1982 closed for renovations, 1982 reopened, still at Disneyland, now called Casa Mexicana. And then in 2001, Casa Mexicana was replaced, and the restaurant today is called Rancho del Zocalo, and it is still there. So if you go to Disneyland and you eat at Rancho del Zocalo, you can remember you're a part of the processed food industry in the United States of America. Okay, so then how do we get to Cheetos? We go Fritos, Doritos, Cheetos. So let's talk about Cheetos now. Cheetos, you can't have a conversation of any of these ultra-processed chip-type foods without discussing partially hydrogenated vegetable oil, of course. In the 1900s, there was a German chemist named Wilhelm Norman, and he figured out how to convert liquid vegetable oil or grossly liquid fish oil into more of a solid type of an oil so that they could use it the same way that you use like lard or beef tallow. Basically, you treat the liquid oil with hydrogen gas under pressure, okay? And then what happens is the hydrogen bonds with the chemical composition of the fatty acids in the vegetable oil. And by combining hydrogen bonds, so saturating the bonds, you form a saturated fat. So you can turn a liquid oil into a solid oil at room temperature, right? So when you have your olive oil, it's still a liquid at your house. That's because it's liquid at room temperature. Your butter is solid. That's why you can leave it out. So that is the difference. Saturated fats they have a higher melting point. They're going to stay solid at room temperature, which is ideal for foods that have to be shipped across the country and sit on a shelf for a while till who knows who's going to buy it. So this turned out to be a way cheaper way to do things than animal fats. So animal fats was very expensive, although more of a natural and real type of a fat, right? But it was harder to get, harder to keep, harder to process, and more expensive. So this guy, Wilhelm Norman, by adding hydrogen gas under pressure, and don't forget the nickel, you had to use a nickel catalyst added into the oil to help this chemical reaction happen. And then later you have to somehow extract the nickel so you're not feeding nickels to people. So hydrogenation, that's what it is. You're adding hydrogen to a substance, you're hydrogenating it. Nickel was removed later. What is partial hydrogenation? This is exactly what it sounds like. Not every bond has a hydrogen attached, just some of them do. And then if you partially hydrogenate something, double bonds can shift. And when the fatty acids have double bonds that are shifted because they've left the catalyst or the nickel slurry too soon, you can end up with trans versions of this. So there's cis and trans versions. All that means in science is the double bond is on one side or the other of a molecule. So it's either on the cis side, which is how most saturated fats occur in nature, or it's on the trans side, which is totally synthetic and abnormal and made in factories. So trans saturated fats, that's what that's talking about. So when you just simply move this one particular, where the double bond is on the side of the molecule, completely changes the molecular structure and how it works in the human body. And that turned out to be a problem. Nobody really realized it at this time. So we also have fully hydrogenated vegetable oils where almost every bond is saturated with a hydrogen atom from the hydrogenation process and no double bonds are left. And so this just shows you the unsaturated fat up top. You see there's a couple of double bonds. It's the two lines that look like an equal sign between carbon molecules. If you have any of those double bonds, it's unsaturated. So you can have monounsaturated, polyunsaturated. And then if you get rid of the double bonds and replace it with a hydrogen molecule, then you get a saturated fat. The difference being they are stiffer, linear, they stay solid, they don't bend and give. And that is the fundamental difference. But the way they bond to proteins and things in your bodies, it's a whole world of difference. And then if you get down to the level of the quantum molecular bonds and how the electrons interact, even more of a difference. But basically one is linear, straight, doesn't really bend. The other one bends a little bit. So, common partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, shortenings like Crisco. You may or may not remember this from growing up. I do. I remember my dad making pie crust with Crisco. Margarine. Margarine was supposed to be the world's savior to prevent all heart disease. You may remember that. Everyone was told to cook with margarine. I can't believe it's not butter, yada, yada. You know, whatever you do, don't eat real butter from an actual animal. That, by the way, butter is just churning cream, very minimally processed if you think about it. And then we've got frying oils, which a lot of them were partially hydrogenated vegetable oils. At the time, the United States Dietary Council was pushing these. They were pushing vegetable oils as a low-fat dietary component. So word on the street at the time was saturated fats cause coronary artery disease. You had to avoid saturated fats at all costs. So the way to do that was to not get fully saturated vegetable oils or saturated fats made from nature, such as tallow or lard, but rather eat more partially hydrogenated vegetable oils because, oh, they're just PUFAs, they're just polyunsaturated fatty acids, they're good for you. And you can be part of your low-fat diet. This is heavily pushed by our government. And this is just an ad from the time frame with Crisco. Talking about how it's just such a great product, so good for you, and all of the features that help it better for cooking, help it be better for cooking. Okay, so trans fats and partially hydrogenated vegetable oils. So remember, trans fats are essentially unsaturated, naturally occurring. These can happen in nature, but very rarely. And when they do, there are only certain types, and they're better for you than the ones that are made synthetically. Cis fats are what we mostly see in nature, I want to say. The carbon-carbon double bond is quite rigid, the one that is remaining. And then the hydrogen bonds, the hydrogen that is binding to the carbons are all on the same side. Remember, that's cis. So when the hydrogens that bond to that carbon from the carbon-carbon double bond, that's converted to a saturated bond. If one is on one side and one's on the other, it's trans. If they're both on one side, it's cis. When they're both on one side, it sort of forces the molecule to bend with that. When they're like this, the molecule can stay straight. A monounsaturated fatty acid is just going to have one carbon double bond in the hydrocarbon chain. And these are all hydrocarbons, just like oil that you put in your, in gasoline is a hydrocarbon. Most organic substances in the world or all involve hydrocarbons. A polyunsaturated fat is going to have more than one of these double bonds. And the double bond, of course, is between the carbon-carbon. So the carbon is connected with a double bond in a monounsaturated or polyunsaturated fat. If you have a fully saturated fat, you don't have that. Everything is bound to hydrogen. No double bonds. And this just kind of gives you a really good picture of this that I found online. If you look at that in the gray circle on both, on the top is your cis double bond. Both hydrogens have bound to the carbon on the same side of the molecule. And then in the trans double bond, it's opposite. And then that keeps it straight somehow. I'm sure by way of the electrons on the outer shell, how they're commingling with each other. And then the cis bends. And if it's bent, it's a little bit more flexible. It fits into things differently, and it's going to interact with proteins and other structures differently. So since all of this was invented, since this technology from Germany was brought over here in the 1900s, the edible vegetable oils have basically taken over the food supply. The global production of edible oils is about 113 metric tons per year. The average consumption per year per person of these edible vegetable oils is about 30 pounds a year globally. In Sudan, it's only about 15 pounds a year. Now, Sudan, obviously, many would consider to be nutritionally deprived. So we'll say that's the low side, 15 a year. Average is 30 a year. In America, we eat about 88 pounds of edible vegetable oils per person per year. Why? Because look at this list of foods that we should avoid. It's found in all of these. And this is your modern grocery store. Breakfast cereals, margarine, fried food, potato chips, crackers, frozen pizza, vegetable shorting, microwave popcorn, pie crust, pastries, add to that cookies, cakes, etc., frostings, non-dairy coffee creamers, so on and so forth. So we eat a ton of edible vegetable oils now. Used to be mostly partially hydrogenated. Now they're either fully hydrogenated or just processed to oblivion and not hydrogenated. Okay, so again, this is showing you part of the processing of an edible seed oil. And then this is showing the trans double bonding of a hydrogenated vegetable oil, okay? So you get a straight chain of these trans bonded unsaturated fatty acids, and then that allows them to crystallize. What does that mean? They precipitate or form solids at room temperature. And then most unsaturated fatty acids in nature are going to be cis bonded. For instance, olive oil, 55 to 80% of it has cis bonded unsaturated fatty acids. And then the hydrogenation process itself will convert some of these cis bonds to trans bonds. It's called an isomerization reaction. So when you isomerize something, you switch the position of a mirror molecule, I guess, and it'll change the character or the physical processes of a liquid or semi-liquid oil to that of a solid oil like a butter or a lard or a tallow. And that's the goal of the food industry, is to get back to what they did get from nature through animal fats, to get the same properties with baking, shelf life, taste, texture, et cetera, but in a cheaper way. And it was all marketed as healthier for you than animal fats. Turns out in natural fats, there are some healthy trans fats, or healthier. For instance, fexenic acid, which is a natural trans fat, is found in dairy products. About 0.4 to 4% of the contents of these ruminant produced fats. Okay, what is a ruminant? It's a creature that chews cud, chews grass and stuff, and then they have multiple stomachs, and it's processed in a series of stomachs in the digestive system. And it turns out the bacteria of ruminants, or grass-eating animals, helps to produce this natural trans fat as a byproduct of the digestive system. And it has health benefits. It's anti-inflammatory in the intestine. It's anti-cancer, lowers LDL, raises HDL. So that is a natural trans fat that turns out to have many human health benefits. Unsaturated or partially hydrogenated oil, again, where mono and polyunsaturated fats are converted into more of a saturated fat. These form unnatural trans fats, so not like vicinic acid, which is formed by bacteria in the stomach of grass-eating creatures, but rather this is created in a factory with nickel and hydrogen gas under pressure. And so the natural polyunsaturated fatty acids in a vegetable oil are destroyed by this hydrogenation process, but you do get a longer shelf life and you don't get rancidity or oxidation. So one of the problems with the polyunsaturated fatty acids, the healthy fats, is they naturally will oxidize over time just by way of their chemical structure. There are some electrons that are easily accessed and can become free radicals. So they will oxidize over time if exposed to UV light, heat, things like that. Okay, so this is showing you the same molecule or molecular structure, carbon 9, hydrogen 17, carbon 9, hydrogen 17, oxygen 2, with a double bond, not double bone, a double bond midway on the carbon chain. What happens if that double bond gets the hydrogen bonded to it in a trans way versus a cis way? What happens to the oil itself? Well, if it's a trans unsaturated fat, it becomes oleic acid. And if it's cis, it's oleic acid. The same molecule, same molecular structure, just one is bent because of where the hydrogen is and one is straight. Oleic acid is found in partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, not so good for you. Oleic acid is the cis version that's found naturally in olive oil and is the main component of olive oil, turns out to be good for you. And then you have stearic acid, again, nearly the same structure. That is the natural saturated fatty acid found in the animal fats, okay? This is what is the intended product when you do full hydrogenation of this unsaturated fat to try to turn it into a saturated fat. So you're trying to create stearic acid out of this molecule by hydrogenating it. But the synthetic versions are never quite as good as the natural versions and turn out to have a lot of health problems for us. So if you were given a choice, you're always going to eat oleic acid first, then you would go to stearic acid, then you would go to oleic acid, not the other way around. So in the 1970s and the 1980s, there were some studies that were put out that suggested that trans fats may actually be the culprit for heart disease, not so much the saturated fats found in animal fats and whatnot. Dr. Mary Enig was one of the pioneers of this world, and she was vilified by the scientific community, much like anybody that has an opinion that's different from the groupthink opinion is often castigated, vilified, denigrated. Sometimes even they try to yank the licenses. They won't publish these people. So she was brave enough to go against the groupthink at the time and said, you know what, guys, it's not really the saturated fats. It's really just the trans fats that happen to be mixed into some of these foods. So what did the FDA do at the time? Oh, it commissioned some studies. 1975 and 1985, the FDA commissioned reviews happened to show that partially hydrogenated vegetable oils were definitely not harmful for human health. By the 1990s, many other studies had come out to prove the exact opposite, which Dr. Mary Enig had figured out from work done in the 70s and 80s and tried to tell the public. But the FDA and all of the big Ivy League institutions and all the big scientific community, including all of the big scientific societies, nutrition societies, dietary councils, et cetera, were very much pro partially hydrogenated vegetable oil, anti-saturated fats. So she was in a lot of trouble at the time, but she stuck through it. And turns out she was right, as were the people that wrote these papers in the 70s and 80s. The people that wrote the papers for the FDA that the FDA asked them to write turned out to be wrong. So in 1976, the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, that group was asked by the FDA to produce a study, and that study had no evidence to show that partially hydrogenated oil is a health hazard. Another FDA commissioned study said that partially hydrogenated oil is no more or little more cholesterolemic than oleic acid. In 1988, the US Surgeon General released a report that trans fats are similar to effect of unsaturated fat in contributions to blood lipids. In other words, nothing to see here. Trans fats are fine. In 1989, the Institute of Medicine, which has changed its name now to the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, said that trans fats are similar to unsaturated fats in the contribution of blood lipids. And this is a picture of the actual book in 1989 produced by the federal government that had all of this. And I'm going to show you a passage from it in the next slide. So this is from that book, talking about polyunsaturated fatty acids and monounsaturated fatty acids. And I just underlined in the second paragraph here, this line about polyunsaturated fatty acids. There are no human diets that naturally have very high levels of total polyunsaturated fatty acids. And there's no information about the long-term consequences of high polyunsaturated fatty acid intakes. I put, really? I mean, what about all of Asia at the time? They have very high diets in omega-3s and natural vegetable oils. So obviously there were diets at the time that did have high levels of polyunsaturated fats. They just chose not to look at them. And then they talked about a little bit later, fish oils. The data on the long-term health effects of large doses of omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids are limited. Again, completely ignoring most of the world's population and what they ate at the time and still to this date. And this was in a published document from the United States government espousing that vegetable oils, partially hydrogenated, were okay, and we should be eating them and should not be eating natural fats like butter and whatnot. And then monounsaturated fats, they talk about that, and they say that clinical studies indicate that the substitution of monounsaturated fats results in a reduction of serum cholesterol and LDL. So they did throw that out for olive oil, which was good. And then they go on and talk more about trans fatty acids and how this is where those lines come from, where they say that the clinical studies indicate that they really don't act that differently in terms of diet than polyunsaturated fats. So they're okay. So it's okay to eat trans fats. So look at this slide showing you from 1909 to 2019, the global production of vegetable oils. So for some reason, this took off, right? We're told it's healthy, told it's okay, we're told saturated fats are bad. So at some point, it became 20% of daily calories, the most consumed food in the world after rice and wheat. And it began simply as a byproduct of cotton harvesting and processing in this country. So the cotton gin is a machine that was used to help process cotton once it had been picked. Well, there was a buildup of unusable gloppy waste from the cotton seeds themselves as the cotton gin processed the cotton. And nobody really knew what to do with this waste product of the processing of cotton. And then what happened was these two gentlemen, William Proctor and James Gamble, figured out that they could use this unusable waste from the cotton gin and use it to make soap and candles, which was one of the first products of Procter & Gamble. Okay, and how did they do it? They could turn this gloppy, semi-liquid mess into more solid fat to use in soap and candles by, guess what? Partial hydrogenation. So these guys actually brought the partial hydrogenation to us as a way to make a usable product from an unusable product. So they basically were trying to use every part of their processing system to make money. And intelligently, they were able to convert this unusable waste product into a usable product and start selling it. But then more things happened after that. That is a cotton gin on the left, or an example of one back in the day. So they took this semi-solid oil that was a byproduct of the cotton gin and they hydrogenated it, okay? And they made it, they made the oil from the cotton seeds semi-solid by hydrogenating it. Used it in soap. They found that it was cheaper than the animal fats that before that was what people used in soap and candles and stuff. Remember, candles were made from whale oil way back in the day. But they had a problem because at this time, the prices were heavily controlled by the meat packing monopolies, the animal fats at the time. And if you remember the meat packing monopolies from the first talk, that was sort of a whole gross industry. But anyway, they're raising the price of these animal fats, raising the price. Procter & Gamble needed something else. They still wanted to sell their soap and candles. So they figured out with this technology from Germany, they're going to hydrogenate the liquid cottonseed oil, which they did. And it looked like lard at the end of the day. And then once they realized they needed yet another product to keep the lights on and to continue to make profits, because guess what happened around the same time is people stopped using candles so much because now everyone was getting electrified. So we started to have more electric lights. Nobody needed as many candles. So they needed another product. They realized it kind of looks like lard. So what did they do? Packaged it up, called it Crisco, and marketed Crisco as an absolutely wholesome and delicious cooking material, brought to you by Procter & Gamble. So these guys had total vertical integration of their industry. They owned 8 cottonseed mills, and then they took that all the way to Crisco. So 1907, they developed the hydrogenation technology for this process with E.C. Kaiser from Germany. Liquid oil would become solid. And then they repurposed the solidified or hydrogenated cottonseed oil to food. So this is one of your early ultra-processed foods. Remember, electricity was replacing candles. They needed a new market. This crystallized cottonseed oil fit the bill perfectly. So we have Crisco now. So the initial marketing of hydrogenated cottonseed oil, okay, was a healthier alternative to cooking with animal fats, more economical than butter. And ingeniously, they published and gave away for free a cookbook with Crisco to teach you how to use Crisco, and they give you recipes and they give you the story of Crisco. And so this is an illustration from the story of Crisco, the book. The young are teaching the old about how to cook with this new modern food process or product that is healthier and more economical, Grandma. And then that is a picture of Crisco, what it is. It's basically lard, but fake lard. So the message that Procter & Gamble put out there was that it's cleaner, it's more economical, it's an enlightened way to cook, it's modern. Good wives use this. Children grow up with good character because it's easier to digest. If you remember the talk about cornflakes, that was a whole push of all these physicians in these reformist Protestant religions that invented all of these easily digestible foods that would build character and diminish lust and things like that. So it was marketed as easier to digest, which helps people grow with good character. And of course, it made kosher cooking much easier. But they used all of these things that tugged at people's heartstrings to sell it, and it worked. People stopped using animal fats and switched to Crisco. This is all just faceless. Mm-hmm. So trans fatty acids are closer to saturated fatty acids than cis fatty acids. So the more trans fatty acids you had in a hydrogenated vegetable oil, the more solid it's going to be, the more like animal fat it'll be. So that was actually better for the food industry and better for the product, but turns out to be not better for health. Crisco today is made from a blend of vegetable oils to include soybean oil, fully hydrogenated palm oil, because that's not illegal, palm oil, mono and diglycerides, citric acid and some other antioxidants, some natural and artificial flavor, and then they always have to put in vitamin A or vitamin E or something to try to keep the few unsaturated fatty acids that are left from oxidizing or developing those free radicals and sort of rotting from within and becoming rancid. So again, just to show you, there's a saturated fatty acid like what you would find in dairy fat or animal fat. There's a cis unsaturated fatty acid, which is what you would find mostly in nature, for instance, olive oil. And then there's a trans fatty acid, which is what you find after factory processing of edible vegetable oils into either partially hydrogenated or fully hydrogenated. So in 1957, there was this big study, the Anti-Coronary Club, a group of New York businessmen that were placed on either a prudent diet or not a prudent diet. The prudent diet had corn oil and margarine, cold breakfast cereals, chicken and fish, and the non-prudent diet had butter, eggs, and beef. And then basically, at the end of the day, they tried to say that the that the prudent diet saved lives in terms of coronary events or heart attacks, but the diet heart study was actually canceled because there was a surprising downside to the study. There were 8 deaths of heart disease in the prudent diet group, and they said none among the controls. I went back and tried to find the original paper. The data in the original paper that I could find online was a little bit different than this and said there were 12 deaths among the controls. So I'm not sure what to believe, and so much on the internet is washed, and even when I find some scientific papers, they've been changed and modified over time. But basically, this is one of the early studies that sort of clued people in that maybe there's something wrong with this message that these synthetic semi-solid fats are good for us. They ended up canceling this study because the results weren't exactly what they wanted to show. So they canceled it for cost and didn't publish the full results. This is one of the problems with scientific literature. If there's a certain theme or thesis that the journal or the press wants, and your study doesn't give those results, you just don't publish that study. You only publish the studies that have the positive results that you want. So later, as studies happened, and then the FDA finally caved on partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, despite Mary Enig trying to fight them since the 70s. There was a nurses' health study. This is a long-term study that included trans fat in the diet for certain surveys. They would ask people, how much trans fat did you eat? The 1990 results showed that the more trans fat a person said they ate per day equated to a much higher risk of heart disease. So about 5.7 grams equated to a 35% higher risk of heart disease. In the Netherlands in the 1990, they did a controlled feeding study. So that's where they actually literally control what you eat. So they're not just doing a survey and asking you to remember what you ate. They controlled it, and they found that the trans fat raised the LDL, lowers HDL. Not what your doctor wants, right? More and more studies, more public pressure, more information coming out. Finally, the FDA has to change their mind. They decided that they would take partially hydrogenated oils off of the GRAS list. What is GRAS? Generally recognized as safe, or a safe part of the food supply. To this point, it was considered safe. You didn't even have to mention it in your label. The final label rule was given in 2003, compliance by 2006. You were allowed to say, and still are, I think, that you have 0 trans fats if you have less than 0.5 grams per serving. But that's before the oil's heated and cooking. That whole process itself creates some trans fats. So a lot of these things that say they have 0 trans fats turn out to have some to begin with, and then they can have more later as you process it at home. Denmark fully banned trans fats in 2003. They were the first country to do so. We were way behind. There was an advocate that sued the FDA in 2013 about this whole no trans fat thing. And then in 2015, the FDA finally revoked the GRAS status of partially hydrogenated oils, with compliance not fully mandatory until 2018. So only since 2018 have we not had partially hydrogenated vegetable oils in our food supply. So all of us grew up on this crap, and it was in our system. 25 years this ban happens in the US by the FDA, 25 years after the first solid evidence of the harms of trans fats. It's just the industry, the government, and the groupthink did not want us to know about it, or they themselves truly didn't believe it, but I can't imagine that. In 2013, this was one of the public pressure campaigns. Somebody did some independent lab testing and then disseminated the information to the public. And this is fascinating. I don't know if anybody remembers Long John Silver's as a fast food seafood chain. I don't even know if they're still around. Long John Silver's Big Catch meal turned out to be the worst restaurant meal in America. And you would think, oh, it's seafood, it's got to be good for me. 33 grams of trans fat in a single meal, 19 grams of saturated fat. This entire meal was fried in partially hydrogenated oils, and it was deemed the worst restaurant meal in America. 1995, a joint letter gets sent to the FDA defending trans fats by none other than the American Society for Clinical Nutrition and the American Institute for Clinical Nutrition. So these guys were pro this Long John Silver Big Catch meal in a way. They defended PHOs in 1995, and this Long John Silver data was put out in 2013. Remember, they didn't even pull it off of the GRAS list till 2015. Compliance wasn't mandatory till 2018.
Still around, and there are a lot of locations.
Yeah, it turns out Long John Silver is still around, but I'm pretty sure they don't make this meal anymore. All right. Next slide. Okay, you might ask, why does this happen? Well, as you may or may not know, or may or may not believe, there seems to be a revolving door between regulators and industry in our government. We see it with Boeing and the FAA. We see it with the SEC and Wall Street, and we see it with the food industry and the USDA and the FDA. There's potentially a revolving door problem here that could have led to this. I don't know. I'm not making accusations. But Fred Mattson, one of the lead scientific officers of Procter & Gamble in 1965, told the American Heart Association to change their diet heart statement and to remove any reference to trans fats. They removed references to trans fats. Whether or not it was because of this, we'll never know, right? 1960s, the edible oil industry was supervised by the American Heart Association and the American Diabetic Association. In 1971, the FDA's general counsel, lead attorney, moved on to head, guess what? The lobby for the edible oils, the Edible Oil Trade Association. And then a food lawyer from the edible oils group replaced him as the lead counsel of the FDA. Mattson of Procter & Gamble was in the leadership group of the Lipid Research Clinical Trials and the National Cholesterol Educational Program in this country. So you see how this is all very interlinked and intertwined and very much in bed with the edible oils industry. George McGovern's Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs promoted the American Heart Association lipid hypothesis at the time. The USDA final report showed that animal fats cause cancer and vegetable oils prevent cancer and cardiovascular disease. But independent research at the same time showed the exact opposite. So you go figure. The government is telling you one thing, independent research is telling you another thing. Who's right? Who's more biased? What do you think? I don't know. Nobody knew at the time. This is a Time magazine picture of Ansel Keys, who wrote the 7 Countries study. Everybody that knows me and watches my material knows that I love the Mediterranean diet. He pushed that, but for different reasons, and probably it's really good for you. Ansel Keys was one of the first voices against saturated fats. But again, at the time, they didn't really understand trans fats and cis fats. That came a little bit later. So it's not so much the saturated fats, it's the trans fats that are bad for us. We didn't figure that out till too late, and then we were 25 years behind the rest of the world anyway. So this brings me to something that you guys need to know about in these studies and how they're marketed, particularly the press. So when the press, the scientific press, wants to write about something and they want to prove a point one way or the other, they will either use the relative risk or the absolute risk, okay? In this same study, if you look at the relative risk versus the absolute risk, you will get 2 completely different stories. So on one side, on the left panel, it's showing you, I want to say that's the relative risk. The right panel's the absolute risk. So if you look at just relative risk, it looks awful. It looks like there's a massive difference. Total plasma cholesterol, powerful predictor of death related to cardiovascular disease. As your cholesterol goes up, you're definitely going to die, and this is totally linked to saturated fats. The other side, it's barely a blip, doesn't really raise that much because that's the absolute risk. So the actual rate increase was 0.13% between these 2 groups, the rate of death from cardiovascular disease. But the relative risk was 240%. So you go from 0.13% to 240% with the same numbers, depending on which formula you use. I'm going to explain that now. So be mindful of this when you read the lay press description of scientific studies. So relative risk is always going to exaggerate the problem. So in this, the cardiovascular death rate, if you had a cholesterol level of 240, was 2 in 1,000. The cardiovascular death rate, if you had a cholesterol level of 160, was 1 in 1,000. The absolute risk, or the absolute change in risk was 1 more death per 1,000 people. So that's 0.001%. But if you look at the relative risk, 2 is more than 1 by 1, so it's a 100% increased risk. Think about that. It's the same number of people, but if you say absolute risk, it's 0.001% increased risk. Relative risk is 100% increased risk. So if you want to push the narrative that high cholesterol and saturated fats cause cardiovascular disease, you're going to talk about relative risk. If you don't, you're going to want to talk about absolute risk. You and me need to know both and decide for ourselves what we believe. Okay, so now we have a ban on trans fats, right? Great. We should all be happy, right? Everybody should be super duper healthy now, but we're not. So now we have RBDs. What is an RBD? This is how we process seed oils now to take the place of our hydrogenated vegetable oils. Refined, bleached, and deodorized. Doesn't that sound palatable? Canola oil, palm oil, corn oil, soybean oil, all RBD'd. What is deodorization? High heat process in a vacuum. Converts the PUFAs to your trans fatty acids, and then they somehow try to get rid of the trans fatties. Reusing oil at a restaurant does the same thing. So canola may go from 0 trans fat when they start the day at a restaurant. By the end of the day, it is 3.3% trans fat. This is a problem. This is why you should never, ever, 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 ever eat at a fast food restaurant, no matter what. And certainly you should try to avoid most restaurants, because I guarantee you they are reusing their oil. So unless you're getting there at 8 in the morning and you know they switched the oil batch overnight, you're eating trans fats in your food, whether you like it or not. And here's the trans fat content of certain oils that are out on the market today. Look at partially hydrogenated soybean oil, 43 to 50% trans fat. Crazy. Next. So I just wanted to throw up some of the chemicals here that is used in the processing of your vegetable oil in your kitchen right now. That is natural bentonite clay on the left. That's used to bleach the oil, to decolorize it, to make it look clear and pretty. That's bentonite clay there as well. And then here's, I found a cosmetic product of the same that's supposed to remove toxins from your body and treat your oily skin and your acne and detoxify the skin. Well, this, which is now being marketed as a cosmetic, is what they use at an industrial level to make your vegetable oil look pretty and clear. That's one part of the RBD process. So that is what's going on with the seed oils that are now being used in all of your snack foods. So probably when this all started out, they used tallow. Like McDonald's French fries used to be fried in tallow, I want to say, not lard. When they first started, that's when McDonald's French fries were really good. Then from a public pressure campaign, they stopped using saturated fats, switched to seed oils, partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, and then they just got even worse for you, and they don't taste as good. So there's a small movement now to get McDonald's to go back to frying in tallow, but I bet you it's never going to happen because it's expensive. So remember, Cheetos were invented in 1948, or maybe we didn't talk about this. We talked about Fritos and Doritos. 1948, he moves on to go to the Cheeto. There was much research and planning that went into this. Basically, it's fried cornmeal coated in a seasoning. Turned out to be massively popular, maybe one of the most popular of all time. In 1961, he realized he had to merge with a bigger company for distribution. So he joined H.W. Lay. Thus is born Frito-Lay, what you now know as Frito-Lay. And then in 1965, they partnered with PepsiCo because PepsiCo had all the convenience store distribution and all the vending machines. And that's why we see these foods everywhere we go now. Because Charles Doolin was smart enough to join with bigger groups that had better distribution and better channels. So this started out as a cheese puff called a corn curl. In 1935, again in the Depression, it actually started at a manufacturer of animal food. So at that place, a grinder flaked some corn, kind of like how they made corn flakes. So this grinder flakes cornmeal, but periodically the machinery needs to be cleaned. Well, how do they clean it? They put this kind of moist corn mix in it and then blow it out under high heat. Well, coming out at the other end of these, I guess the tubes in the machine were like puffy corn blobs. So this guy, Ed Wilson, an employee, took them home, seasoned them up and deep fried them and made corn curls. Again, with a byproduct that was just going into the trash. So sort of ingenious. So a food experiment is now a business is what the headline of this old paper shows, 1941. The puffed end product of a machine's cleaning cycle was called a collet. They actually had a name. Wilson ended up transferring ownership of the corn curl to this guy, Reed. Reed went into the Navy in World War II. So he ended up having to get rid of it. Somebody else bought it, but they called it the corn kinks. The corn kinks died eventually because they ran out of ingredients, because of rationing during the war. They tested it at a local tavern, and they figured out that the best version of the corn kinks was when they deep fried it and added cheese flavor. So then Reed bought out Wilson, then this guy Adams bought out Flake-All, on and on with this corporate diatribe, and we ended up with Maddox Metalworks, which makes part of the machine that Frito-Lay uses. So it ended up going to the Frito-Lay company, the corn curls that became the corn kinks, then became the Cheetos. Today, actually this is not today, it's probably way more today. 2010, $4 billion annually in sales just from the Cheeto. Turns out Japan is the center of innovation and flavors for the Cheetos. This is sort of crazy. They have a strawberry icing Noblito, a Mountain Dew coated Noblito, and a Pepsi coated Noblito. So in Japan, they're willing to try anything and everything in different flavorings, and then whatever hits there, they bring back over here. One of the most potent, addictive, and economically viable versions of the Cheeto was the Flamin' Hot Cheeto. That completely reinvigorated Cheetos and is hugely addictive. So again, what is a Cheeto? It's just cornmeal mixed with vegetable oil. Why? Because it gives it the perfect crunch and you can shape it any way you want. The process of shaping the collets for Cheetos is a very closely held trade secret to get that really weird, bizarre shape they all have. They usually use corn or sunflower, I think sometimes canola. And then they have very high production plants to make enough oil and enough Cheetos for the world. And this just shows you, sorry, that slide just shows the linoleic acid content of certain liquid oils. Linoleic is O6 or omega-6. Linolenic is omega-3. So this is your O6 content of various oils as a percentage. This is just, we're not going to go through this, but just look how complicated it is. This is the edible oilseed processing algorithm, just so you know, ending with bleaching and deodorizing. Here's your Cheetos ingredient list. Don't worry, 0.2 grams of trans fat only at this time. I think the label now says 0%. I'd have to go pull a bag, but wait, I don't have any here. Enriched cornmeal, vegetable oil, cheese seasoning, canola oil, maltodextrin, natural and artificial flavor, salt, whey protein, monosodium glutamate, again, lactic acid, citric acid, yellow number 6, milk ingredients, salt, blah, blah, blah. Why does this matter? Why are these addictive? And this is really the only science in this talk right now. These foods use your brain's pathways to create demand. So one way you can sell something is to make people want it more, or you can make something cheaper, more plentiful, right? What these snack food companies have done is both. They have figured out a way to make you want the product more, and they've made it cheap enough that you can keep buying it over and over and over again, and you never run out of money for these things. They've hijacked the dopamine reward system pathway in your brain, They've disrupted your ghrelin and leptin pathways. Ghrelin's the hunger hormone, leptin's the satiety or I'm full hormone. They've manipulated your serotonin levels in the brain and in the gut. They've provided a way to very rapidly deliver simple carbs that are easily digestible and fats. And they've done massive sensory engineering. Think about this. If I asked you to sit with a spoon and eat salt, you would stop at a certain point because you just would not be able to tolerate it and your body would make you stop eating it. But if I gave you a bowl and I mixed salt and sugar with probably a little bit more sugar than salt, you would never stop eating it. So when you add sugar to a salty food, which they do, I've already showed you that, or you add salt to a sugary food, you are hijacking all of the normal natural stop points in the brain to stop eating. It is ingenious and it is addictive. And you just need to know about it. I'm not saying they have to stop making these products, but you need to know about it. And then you can decide if you want to be addicted to it because of this manipulation of your brain. I don't, but some people do. And some people are okay with that. That's okay. But I don't think it's really good for me. So I don't want to eat these kind of foods, but this is how it ends up tricking you to eating more and more and more. With a tagline, you can't just eat one or you can't eat just one. It's very true. So this is your seed oil and fatty acid content. I just want you to look at olive oil, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 down. Olive oil has the most monounsaturated fats of all, and one of the lowest levels of saturated fats, okay, and a good amount of polyunsaturated. So I think olive oil is probably your healthiest option, pretty much bar none for cooking and eating. So just keep that in mind. All of these other things all change when you process with heat and you add deodorization and bleaching and whatnot. Avocado oil is not on the list. Avocado oil has a high level of omega-6, and olive oil is the second oil I choose to cook with normally. I do not use vegetable oil at all anymore, if I can help it. Okay, so when you have too much linoleic acid in something, or O6, omega-6, it's easy to become oxidized. We talked about that already. The polyunsaturated fats can allow more free electrons or free radicals to happen, and that ends up causing oxidative damage to the oil itself, and it becomes a self-feeding cycle. Oxidized fats in a low-density lipoprotein is worse than an unoxidized fat. The oxidized fats are what cause the plaquing. So the macrophages, the white blood cells come in to get rid of the oxidized fat, and it creates what's called a foam cell inside of your arterial lining, and that becomes a plaque, which eventually can become a heart attack or a stroke. So if you're going to have high LDL, you definitely don't want oxidized LDL. So you really don't want a ton of omega-6 in your LDL. Well, unfortunately, nowadays we do have that because soybean oil, one of the most common oils on the planet now, particularly here, is 50 to 60% omega-6. The American diet is replete with omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids now, really to our detriment. That is the most common form of fat I think that we're getting. And it's in all of these edible oils, edible vegetable oils. No, but I will. Okay. So linoleic, remember, is omega-6. Linolenic is omega-3. Linoleic acid is highly susceptible to oxidation. The primary target in your LDL particles. 90% of your LDLs is probably omega-6 oils now because of our diet in America. The free radicals trigger this process called peroxidation, which is when the oil destroys itself, and oxidized lipid products form. So basically, all of your LDL particles floating around in your blood are becoming rancid. Think of it that way. They're becoming like smelly old oil you found in the closet from like 1920. That's what's happening in our bodies. It accumulates in the arterial wall as a foam cell and then becomes a plaque. We think, and of course there's no true consensus on this, but there's starting to be, that vegetable oils processed vegetable oils potentially increase this risk. Omega-6 oils naturally go down an inflammatory pathway. So as they're processed, they become arachidonic acid, which then becomes pro-inflammatory cytokines like prostaglandins and leukotrienes. And this is whenever inflammation is induced in your body for whatever reason. Alternatively, or conversely, the omega-3s, the linolenic acids, now that's what you're going to find in fish and grass and things like that, goes down a different pathway and it'll become EPA and DHA, and these become eicosanoids that are minimally inflammatory, and actually they become proteins that help the body heal and help shut down inflammation that is damaging. These are called resolvins and protectins. Doesn't that sound pretty? Omega-3 becomes pretty molecules that help you. Omega-6 becomes acidy, damaging, inflammatory molecules that hurt you. Most people with autoimmune disorders produce a ton of these omega-6 byproducts, which is why many studies show over and over again that in particular, if you have autoimmune conditions like rheumatoid, for example, lupus, etc., the higher your levels of omega-3 in your diet, or better if you supplement with omega-3, the less inflamed you will be and there will be less pain. This is why I'm a big proponent of supplementing with omega-3, because the American diet is so terrible and so low in omega-3s, it's really the only way you can get a better balance. The linoleic acid level in American fat tissue, so they've taken like core samples of American fat over time, was less than 10% in 1959, and it's 22% just about in 2008. So you can imagine now it's probably got to be a quarter of the fat at least. So sadly, the newer seed oils that we make today with the newer genetically modified crops and the crops that have been bred for this industry of soybean oil and corn oil have very high levels of omega-6 linoleic acid, much higher than what was found evolutionarily in the same plants. This ends up breaking down to different chemical byproducts that have been shown to increase levels of arachidonic acid and other molecules that cause inflammation and also cancers, and into products that induce the formation of things called aldehydes and ketones, aldehydes being in the family of advanced glycation end products. So what happens is when you have low density lipoproteins filled with these O6 and particularly oxidized ones, no longer can the LDL receptor recognize the molecule. It's unrecognizable. It's been disguised. But it can be recognized by macrophages, which are the white blood cell cleanup machines. And then you get a foam cell, and then you get a heart attack. So not a good source of omega-3 are newer vegetable seed oils. A great source of omega-6, which is why we will never achieve the ideal dietary ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. We have 10 to 20 to 1, omega-6 to omega-3. So why are companies why are they doing this to us? It's cheap. You can produce this very cheap, very large quantities. I mean, think about the massive size of the corn and the soybean farms in this country. You get a really nice neutral flavor of these oils, and then you can engineer whatever food you want to whatever flavor profile you need. They're very heat stable. Remember, they're not going to self-oxidize because of the way the bonds are, that it won't let these free radicals fly off during the processing. So theoretically, you can deep fry with them, although people are now questioning even that. The texture of the food becomes more pastry-like, like it's better, like it's almost like it's butter again, the way it feels to the mouth. And mouthfeel is huge in the addiction pathway. They last longer on the shelf, so that lowers your inventory costs and your waste costs. And remember, the United States dietary guidelines propagated by our government and our elected leaders, and really the bureaucrats, have vilified all saturated fats since at least the 1950s. Veggie oils were always pushed, animal fats were denigrated. So now there is a school of thought that maybe we've had it wrong all along. So basically, seed oils became the go-to replacement for hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, which were the go-to replacement for animal fats. And now we're going full circle. A lot of people are now going back to the animal fats. The American Heart Association supported seed oils as a way to get more O6 PUFAs in your system. They thought the more O6, the better, because then you'll have fewer saturated fats in your diet. Well, that's great and all, but it depends on how much of the PUFA turns into trans fat. Do you get any omega-3 in your diet? What saturated fat are you replacing? Are you replacing dairy fat, which turns out to be heart protective? Or are you replacing highly processed CAFO factory-fed cow fat? So there's so many variables in this argument. So it's still being looked at. Some people think seed oils aren't toxic at all. Some people, including the American Heart Association News here, will tell you there's no reason to avoid seed oils and plenty of reasons to eat them. Some people will say consistently that all data show that butter and lard are bad for you. So again, you just got to remember a few things: absolute risk, relative risk, who funded the study, where did they work before they wrote the book, the paper, and where do they work after, things like that. And just start to put it all together for yourself. And also, let's be real, when seed oils came on the market along with the genetically modified crops that helped to create the massive abundance of plant that goes into this matter, somehow, somewhere along the way, the obesity rates went up, as did all chronic diseases at the same time. Now, is it causal? Is it correlative? That's still being looked at. So saturated fats do increase LDL. Yes, they do. But they also increase your HDL levels. So generally speaking, the ratio of your LDL to your HDL stays the same. And they will slightly increase or increase your triglyceride levels. Saturated fats from dairy are heart protective. Remember I showed you that ruminant produced trans fatty acid, valinic, I think, from dairy products. So it turns out some dairy saturated fats aren't so bad for you. Trans fats are the real bad guys. Much like saturated fats, trans fatty acids will increase your LDL, but unlike saturated fats, they lower your HDL. So you get a worse ratio of LDL to HDL if you eat trans unsaturated fatty acids versus saturated fatty acids from animal products. Does that make sense? The ratio stays the same, although you have more LDL with saturated fats. The ratio gets worse and you have more LDL with trans fats. This is what Mary Enig tried to tell the FDA and people back in 1970s. Nobody wanted to listen. So in summary, we sort of went over the historical context of the creation of these super snacks and the super snack industry and the processing of foods, and how the fear of saturated fats and the sort of dogma of the time, which is still ongoing, kind of led into the popularity of these food items. And then how hydrogenated oils came on the market as really just a scientific way to create a semi-solid or solid fat in a more cheap and effective manner than slaughtering animals. And then we talked about how vegetable oils affect your health. We didn't get too deep into it, I know. Talked about the processing, the RBDs, the refined, bleached and deodorized vegetable oil processing methods, how linoleic acid levels have increased in the adipose tissue of Americans, our omega-6, omega-3 ratios, what oxidized LDL does to you, and how seed oils plays into this. All of this is important for you to know, and we talked about the addictive potential of these foods and why they're addictive. So I think if you go to the grocery store armed with this knowledge, it helps you get more of a growth mindset about food, more of a health mindset. If you still want to eat a Cheeto knowing all this and you want to enjoy that Cheeto, then you should. But I bet you will end up eating far fewer Cheetos in your life if you think about this stuff while you're eating it. And then have a handful of blueberries and think about how amazing those are for your health. They don't taste anything alike each other, but eventually your body's going to crave the blueberry far more than the Cheeto once you gain this health and growth mindset. And the only way to do that is with knowledge. And that's what I'm hoping to give you guys with this talk and others in the series. So we talked about the economic realities of the world, the depression, things like that. And then the genius of American ingenuity, which, like all things in the world, you can have good uses and bad uses, but how smart to turn unused byproducts from the cotton processing into a food. What? And the byproducts of the cleaning process of corn machinery into a food. And then, oh, let's just flavor some fried tortillas and call it a Dorito. I mean, these are genius products, but turns out over time, they've become less and less healthy for us. When they started, they were very minimally processed and probably reasonable in a way. The highly processed production methods we now use is really the problem. Yes, the foods are delicious. Yes, they're addictive. Yes, they last forever on the shelf, but they bypass all satiety centers in your brain and you just keep eating them and they're destroying you and oxidizing your LDL at the same time. Just know there are many controversies in the seed oil world. I'm sure you're aware of that. Some people still love seed oils. Some people loathe them. I'm on the closer to the I try to avoid them side, but I'm not going to not eat at all just to not eat a seed oil. I try to avoid them. I try to stick to olive oil if at all possible. Beware of the source of any study you read. Beware of who funded it. Beware of the revolving door in the government regulatory agencies. And it's not just our country, it's globally. And all the global groups have the same problem, like the WHO and all those big health groups. Make good decisions based on your understanding. Have a good growth and health mindset about these foods. And just remember, plenty of people out there think organic food is a bunch of crap and made up nonsense voodoo. Plenty of people think seed oils are great. Plenty of people love a good partially hydrogenated vegetable oil, and they're going to still make pie crust with Crisco. It is what it is, and that's okay. But you just need to know this, and then you make your own decisions. If you have any questions, I'm happy to field them. I think my next talk is going to be high fructose corn syrup, or the next talk in this series anyway, because that's another fascinating industry. Oh, and this is my book that I wrote, Bone on Bone, and I talk about different ways to get healthy and avoid surgery and avoid pain and avoid stiffness and aches and creaks and all that, and all the things that you have been taught are aging and inevitable. They are not. And it's totally fixable with simple moves in your life. And this is your guidebook, Bone on Bone, an orthopedic surgeon's guide to avoiding surgery and healing naturally, coming from a surgeon. And these are products that we have in my line of natural supplements, all made in the United States and third-party tested. Berberine to reduce the glycemic load of your meals. It acts like metformin. 15-day liver complex to help prevent NASH or non-alcoholic steatosis or fatty liver disease. Resveratrol, which is a super strong antioxidant and actually has been studied to treat pain and arthritis successfully. The omega-3s, we talked about that. I think everyone needs to be on omega-3 supplements. And then vitamin K and olive oil. Vitamin K not only helps your vitamin D3 build your bone better, but it also prevents the calcification of those foam cell-derived plaques in your arterial walls. So vitamin K is important in two ways calcium messes with us in the body. It'll help it go to bone with D3 and make stronger bones and prevent osteoporosis. And it'll keep it from going to the arteries and making plaques for you. All right, everybody go have a great day and enjoy this wonderful time of year.